Hello, welcome to the Wise Way to Success podcast. And today I have a very special guest, Karen Gosbee. She wrote an incredible book that deals with addiction, mental health, and survival. I am on a mission to help people with their mental health. Thank you for tuning in to the Wise Way to Success. Thank you, Karen, for joining me today.
Thank you for having me on your podcast.
So Karen wrote a book. It's called A Perfect Nightmare. And it's a true story. It's a true story that deals with a lot of very powerful, relatable themes. Addiction, betrayal, abuse. Karen, thank you so much for sharing your story through this book. Could you tell people who are not familiar with the story a little bit about you?
Sure. I guess from the outside it looked like I had everything. I was married to George Gosbee, and he was a very successful investment banker. He started a couple companies, and he was an advisor to many prominent people within Alberta and across Canada. And from the outside, it looked like we had everything. We had a great house, vacation homes, 3 beautiful kids. And, we were up and up, very prominent in the community. And behind closed doors, it was a completely different story.
So what was happening behind closed doors?
Well, behind closed doors, we were having to deal with the issues, the all too common issues of, mild mental illness to more extreme mental illness, depending on what other external forces were at play. And when I say that, there was addiction, there was infidelity, there were a lot of things that we were dealing with within the 23 years of marriage. And then there was the domestic violence or corrosive control that was a common theme or thread throughout the marriage. And after that happened with my upbringing, I decided that I needed to come forward because I had experienced in my own childhood addiction and mental health issues within my family. It wasn't me myself, although I could argue that because I am somehow attracted to these trauma-like situations, which I came from. And then it followed me into my marriage. And what I realized was the system was really had not changed since 1982, when our family my family of origin had its own crisis, to when we were weaving in and out of the system, from about 2000 on. It was, the same strategies, the same modalities, the same medications, and basically the lack of organization. So I wanted to come forward and talk about mental illness, mental health, about trauma in the family and domestic violence, and just share the story because I think it's a lot more common than people are willing to relate or even understand.
Absolutely. I mean, I see clients who either are in abusive relationships, they know people in abusive relationships, they are familiar with somebody who has an addiction and it's really hard on them. How was it living with a person with an addiction, a severe addiction?
Well, again, that was something that I grew up with, so I almost had the training wheels to manage that. And when somebody has addiction, everybody sort of revolves around that person's addiction. And, I had definitely developed a lot of negative behaviors around managing it, where I would, be very destructive to myself or the relationship of the person that had the addiction. And, it's hard because you tend to completely neglect yourself, mm-hmm. and the focus becomes that negative nucleus that you're trying to manage all the time. And it wasn't really until, and I talk about that more in detail, mm-hmm. until I went into Al-Anon, mm-hmm. where I started to understand my really destructive and the bad behaviors, because you go into a common community, you hear these stories over and over and over again, and it's a pure, structure where you're mentoring people that have come from a similar situation and they've found, healthier ways of managing the situation they're in that you can follow.
So, what advice could you offer somebody right now who's in an abusive relationship with somebody who is struggling with addiction? What would be something that you would tell them?
Well, the first thing I would say is that those don't always go hand in hand.
Right.
Like a lot of times, I think if you're in a relationship that's addicted, it's abusive right across the board just because your needs are not being met, because that person that you're in the relationship with is more committed to their addiction. So there's an element of neglect, which is abuse. And people don't typically think of that as being abuse, but neglect is one of the major you would know more about this than I did, but it on the adverse childhood experiences, it's a main sort of, help me out here.
Well, it creates, what happens is with addiction is it creates an emotional abandonment. So
Yeah.
the person doesn't feel like they're priority, or they don't feel that they're there. The addiction is almost like a mistress in the relationship as it becomes, this other party. I know people who say, I give my partner the time to, go into the room and drink. Or I created a pot room for them, almost as though you're creating space for their addiction, but actually what you're doing is exactly what you said. It's not healthy. There's something that's not healthy about that, because there is something interfering with the relationship. The addiction is an entity that is coming between you and your partner.
And you're being neglected in it as well.
And you're being neglected. And it's true. It's not right. In a relationship, you should feel united, not neglected.
Yes.
So
and I don't think people really understand that, especially people that tend to seek out trauma-like relationships. And if you come from that and you are naturally attracted to that, that is normal. And that in itself is a little bit of an awareness and education people have. But the other thing I want to emphasize too is that you don't need to have addiction to be in an abusive relationship.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
There's a lot of, you also don't have to be, I know in your story, you were physically assaulted, but you don't even need to be physically assaulted to be in an abusive relationship. You can be verbally assaulted. You could be neglected. There are different ways. Could you help the Wise Way community who's watching this now know the signs of being in an abusive relationship? Because they're not all clear. Like, they're not all black or white.
Well, absolutely. The number one thing is if they're trying to isolate you and they try and control you financially. And, there's actually a chart, Bitterman's chart of corrosion, that you can refer to that was developed in, it was in the 50s, this post-war, people that were prisoners of war, and they had, got them back once they had been in captive forever, and they realized that they still had this odd kind of loyalty to people that had captured them and tortured and tormented them for years and years, and they really studied them, and they came out with these 8 characteristics, and then they started to realize that these 8 characteristics and tactics that they used were exactly the same tactics that perpetrators use in abusive relationships. And it's a kind of it's a long drawn out erosion of the person's identity, where they completely monopolize everything about that person. But there's systems of rewards and it's a cycle of where they will be abusive and then they pull away and then they're nice and they win them over again. And it's a brainwashing technique that is really commonly used with prisoners of war, with people joining cult, sex trafficking, like anything where someone's at a disadvantage and someone is using power and control. And, the thing about that is once you start to discover these common tactics like the love bombing, the, isolating from family and friends, taking over financial, freedom, and telling them what to wear, and, wanting to know where they go all the time. Those are all the very common signs. But once you dig a little bit deeper and you just realize that these tactics are really, really common and everybody uses it that's in a situation like that, I would really encourage anyone that maybe thinks that, and I'm saying this because I was one of these people. I was in that relationship for 23 years and I knew it was unhealthy, but I had no idea how unhealthy it was until I really started to go down that rabbit hole of learning about corrosive control, domestic violence, and everything else we're talking about right now.
I think it's important for people to know the signs, and one of the biggest signs I see with people is they try to fix things or try to help the person change, and they fall into this like caretaking role. Well, I'm going to help this person out of this. I'm going to be there for them. But that's a trap. That's actually a trap.
Absolutely.
So we have to be mindful of the relationship that we're in and the behaviors and actions that we are engaging in when we're in this type of relationship, because most likely if you're with somebody who is self-destructive or violent or abusive, most likely if you're in that relationship, you're kind of hoping they're going to change. You're kind of hoping that you're going to be able to fix them. And I think that's a common trap that people fall into and why they stay. But you have to be mindful of that, because this is not a healthy dance. And it's a very unhealthy relationship dance that actually does not usually end well. And unfortunately, in your case, with your husband, he took his life.
Which is another tactic that they use, where they constantly threaten suicide to control you. But going back to what you're saying, you're absolutely right. And Farrell and Johnson have specific things where women will try and dismiss, and it's not always women, but they will dismiss the abuse that's occurring. The reason why I say women is because 95% of the time it is cisgender, female or trans, that end up being in situations like this. But the first is, I can change him. The second is, he's not really like that. And the third is, it's just easier to forget. And then they'll say it's partly my fault. Mm-hmm. And the last one, and that's when they're, completely in a very compromised, 100% controlled situation, where they actually have nowhere to go because people have given up on them. They can't go to authorities because they're too much in danger. And, we could talk a lot about that, but the statistic out there is 20% of people come forward that are in domestically violent relationships, and that 80% of it is underground, because most of these people feel like there is nowhere to go. Mm-hmm. And quite frankly, I think the system out there has not supported the best pathways for women to get out and to be protected and to protect their children as well.
No, it's a horrible feeling to feel stuck, to feel trapped. There needs to be changes done, absolutely. Karen, your book is very honest, it's very raw, it's very real. You talk about yourself, you look at the things that you've done. What were you hoping? Because when writing a book like this, there's going to be some backlash too, right? Which you knew about. So what were you hoping to achieve by sharing your story to the world?
Well, when George passed by suicide, I was approached by a journalist saying, would I talk about it? And I thought, I need to talk about this. And I wanted to do it under the banner of the help is there. It needs to be a bit better coordinated, and people need to start talking about this to reduce the shame and stigma. And somebody had come to me that I really respected and said, don't come out with a domestic violence story because you will be discredited with what you're trying to do, that was like, whoa, I was not expecting that at all. But I guess in telling my story, I was put into a situation where George had made some really bad financial decisions that now are my responsibility because I'm the executor of the estate. And I decided that we put together 16 diaries that I had hidden all over the house, because if he found them, he would use that as ammunition to, for his abuse. But I decided with those 16 diaries, it would be very easy to make a book out of what I had done. And if I could help one person just be able to relate to what I went through, and I didn't want to be salacious to who he was and the decisions he had made, his family, or anything like that, or even his coworkers, or the fraternity of, what I speak about, of the type of work that he was involved with, because quite frankly, it happens in everywhere in life, right? Like, it doesn't matter, what you do as a profession. I wanted someone to just be able to relate with my story and to be able to say, this might be a little similar to what I'm going through, and I'm going to find out more information about it and make a healthier, wiser choice sooner than I did. Because I was in this marriage for 23 years. And, if I can help someone when they're younger, my mission is accomplished.
So,
or even older people, for that matter.
I think it's reachable and relatable to anybody who's going through this, and people who know people who are going through this. Is there any last words of wisdom that you would like to share with the viewers today?
I think we need to keep talking about this. Like, it's just, my big thing is to drive for corrosive control to be legislated, that it's against the law, that it's a criminal offense. If we build public awareness about it and it becomes not okay, I equate this to marital rape. Like, it was finally not okay to do that in 1984. We need to get this legislated, and people need to have that awareness and understanding. And I think that, the more we talk about it, the more people discover and build their education awareness around it. I think it will be better managed, and people will be better off when it comes to just violence in general in society.
I agree. We have to keep bringing attention to it. It's not a topic people like to talk about. Addiction, abuse, domestic violence, but it's a topic we need to talk about. I want to thank you so much, Karen, for joining me today. I consider you a wise mentor. So thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, sharing your story with the audience and with the world. And I'm very grateful for people like you who use their stories to help other people. So important. It gives hope, it gives inspiration, and it gives guidance. So thank you so much. And I want to thank all the people watching today. I'm wishing you all a very wise day. Thank you all.